We got some big updates about the North Korean-Russian relationship as they're signing new pacts, and Putin decided to go there, and he got like the treatment I assume humanity would give if they found Jesus Christ had returned from the dead. There's rows of children with flowers and Russian flag just waving them, a big portrait of Putin and Kim next to each other, tons and tons of Russian flags along every road they were going to travel, extravagant speeches talking about the glory of the DPRK Russian relationship and its birth, and the anti-colonial struggle against the Japanese, and then the Korean War that followed shortly after. Just a lot of bells, whistles, and noise to flatter both Vladimir Putin, but also presumably Kim-Jong by having the first visit from Putin to North Korea, I believe, ever. Because I remember reading like this is the first visit in like 24 years, and I was thinking, so is that just the entirety of Putin's time in power? Unless he visited literally in 1999 during the Chechen Wars, that would mean that he's basically never visited North Korea, or hasn't in 24 years, either way. So this is a significant visit just for the historical precedent of been 24 years since a visit like this has taken place. There's so much bells and whistles, and they're trying to give this as much cultural and diplomatic oomph from their verbal commitments, and I guess the flair that you've seen from their parades as possible, to give you a taste of it. And I don't want to show you everything, because you don't need to look at all the speeches, you don't need to listen to Putin's speech, you don't need to listen to everything. Just show you a little bit of the pompous circus that they put on here before we talk about the meat and potatoes of actually what this could entail for not only the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also North Korea enhancing their nuclear capabilities. Does their handshakes really need theme music? The Russian anthem. Now there's all the children that they've taken out of school to praise the blood-covered dictator. Oh, sorry. Obviously, when I say blood-covered dictator, that could mean either person, but I did mean Putin. You know, can I just throw out there that you would think all of the people who base their politics on like aesthetics of like strongman politics, you know, the Jackson Hinkles, the Scott Ritters, the Douglas McGregors, all these clowns, you would think with them always talking about like how soyed out and woke and stupid the American military is, and how they're accepting too many fat people or trans people or gay people or whatever it is, that some of them would make a comment about the fact that Kim Jong-un is just so unbelievably fat.
Something to scrub with for the soot. I get that crap on me all the time as a diesel mechanic.
Thank you for the $10 for Dawn dish soap to clean off the soot. I appreciate the $10 donation. But what I was saying is just like Kim is. I mean, I know Kim has had health complications over his weight, but I cannot tell if he's taken any effort to tackle it at all. I remember at one point he lost a lot of weight. I thought maybe he had like liposuction or something, but I mean, if he did, he's ballooned right back up there. My goodness. By the way, it's kind of hard to tell who's taller, but yesterday it did seem like Kim Jong-un is slightly taller than Putin, even though they're both very, very short men. Okay, I'm not going to do the whole speeches because the speeches are quite boring, and they're quite, let's just say frilly, full of, you know how Putin's speeches are. We saw what that interview was like with Tucker Carlson, where Tucker Carlson was like, hey, let's talk about the war. And it was like, Putin was like, oh, of course. So it all starts in 988 when Prince Yaroslav's horse took a giant shit in Kiev. Like you don't need that. You don't need all this pop circumstance. So the only moment of the speech that I think is semi-important is where Vladimir Putin hinted at helping arm the North Koreans with long-range technology to help them target not only U.S. installations throughout Asia, but also, presumably, Japan, South Korea, or any other country in the region that they deem to be deserving of the Kim family's wrath. By the way, this is being posted by Aussie Cossack. The only reason I'm using this clip is because it was the first one that came up. I do want to point out that Aussie Cossack is a huge loser. Like a massive loser, crybaby moron. And I'm not trying just to be mean because he supports the Russians. I'm being mean because the dude is currently hiding in the Russian embassy in Australia because he went to a pro-Ukraine protest, beat up a very elderly man, and then ran to the Russians for safety because he didn't want to be arrested for assaulting the elderly. Strong conservative Russian values on display again on the international support for Russia. I gotta say, one moment that I did feel a real connection with Russian state media, and specifically Solovyev, was when he was complaining about the fact that they always get the freaks from the United States. And it's kind of true. Douglas McGregor, someone who only lies through his teeth. Jackson Hinkle, who is an egomaniac. Scott Ritter, who is a kitty diddler. An Aussie Cossack who assaults the elderly. It's like the dream team of freaks and degenerates. Anyway, let's listen to what Putin had to say. I would like to draw attention to statements of the United States and other NATO countries on the supply of high-precision weapon systems of longer-range capability, F-16 aircraft, other high-tech weapons, and equipment for striking Russian territory. In this regard, the Russian Federation does not exclude the development of military technology cooperation with North Korea, in accordance with the signed document today. Now, it is true that this could technically be a hinting of allowing North Korea to take long-range technology, as Aussie Cossack has suggested. So it's not technically a lie. But he didn't specify long-range missiles. He didn't specify long-range rocket or anything like that. What Putin is basically doing here is he's hinting at continuing to develop the North Korean-Russian military cooperation. So the North Koreans would be able to go to Russia and access, say, technological developments when it comes to their missiles and their rockets, or maybe when it comes to their defense systems, or any number of things that they might need. Maybe when it comes to development of nuclear weapons, who knows? This is something that a lot of people have fear of, but the North Koreans have been using the Russians to shield themselves internationally. For example, and this isn't payment, this is being paid for. The North Koreans are sending tons and tons of shells over to the Russians, and there have been complaints from Russian soldiers of the quality of those shells. I've heard many jokes and comments from Ukrainian soldiers making fun of those shells. And I remember it's been more than once where I've been on the front, we hear a shell whistling, it sounds like it's going to be close, we brace, and then there's no sound. Shell was a dud. And multiple times I've heard people respond to that, basically saying, North Korean. Those are North Korean shells. There is another North Korean one. And so it's openly being mocked, the fact that a lot of these shells don't have the proper amount of propellant. A lot of these shells have been in reserve forever. A lot of these shells are not of the highest quality. Russian soldiers would prefer to have other types of shells. But at the end of the day, if the war is in large part about the amount of firepower you can lay on the battlefield, now it's not just that. It's also the precision of the firepower, it's cost effectiveness of said firepower, the military economics of the matter. It's a whole host of different topics. But the amount of firepower itself is, of course, a crucial element. And so if the Russians are able to get 1 million shells, and even if half of them are crappy, terrible shells that are short of propellant and they don't go as far as they should and they miss the target by half a mile, that's still 500,000 shells that could still effectively hit a position and kill Ukrainian soldiers. It's still explosive material, it's still shrapnel, it's still a shell that can still do damage. And so while the North Koreans are paying through shells, in return, at least the idea is, the Russians would give them not only military economic development, but also backing them up internationally, diplomatically, when it comes to sanctions, as the Russians would not renew and would not vote to renew the sanctions on North Korea as of just a few months ago, placed by the international community for the development of its nuclear weapons program, along a host of other violations of international law. continuing here, here's an article from AP if you wanted to read a little bit more about the deal and some of the history of the deal. This article goes into the long history of DPRK, Russian relations, and a lot of the flowery gifts that they gave each other. I believe Vladimir Putin gave Kim Jong-un a limousine and a naval dagger, and Kim Jong-un gave Putin a bunch of paintings of Vladimir Putin because these are dictators, they're egomaniacs. This is the type of stuff they love, just to have big framed pictures of themselves. But then again, I'm a streamer, so streamers are egomaniacs as well. Either way, they talk about in this, and we'll just read here. Russian President Vladimir Putin and North Korean Kim Jong-un signed an agreement Wednesday that pledges mutual aid if either country faces quote-unquote aggression, a strategic pact that comes as both facing escalating standoffs with the West. Details of the deal were not immediately clear, but it could mark the strongest connection between Moscow and Pyongyang since the end of the Cold War. Both leaders described it as a major upgrade of their relations, covering security, trade, investment, cultural, and humanitarian ties. Now, we don't know all of the details of the deal. They have not revealed all of the details of the deal. In fact, most of what Russian state media has covered of the deal has been just the pompous circus that they've put on around it. In fact, I saw this one Russian propagandist, and I forget who he was. Maybe somebody in chat will remember. But he had his phone out, and he was recording himself as the North Koreans behind him were like shaking flowers and going like ah da and like screaming as they do at these rallies and military parades. Because of course, Korea had to put on a military parade to honor Russian President Vladimir Putin coming over. He recorded himself and he said, "Wow, look around. These must be some of the freest people on the planet." I honestly cannot tell from the clip if he was joking or if he was being serious, because it's such a ridiculous statement that even like the most brainwashed, like filtered through state media segment after state media segment individual that could be watching that show could not possibly be under the assumption that North Korea is a particularly free place to live. I know that human rights and civil liberties in Russia has continued to deteriorate. Their elections are more shammy than ever. Any minority, like LGBT nightclubs getting raided, monitoring from the government becoming more and more thorough, any opposition to the war being prosecutable with criminal charges, and people getting arrested simply for saying Bucha was real on streams on the internet. So, I mean, in a way, Russia is becoming the North Korea of Eurasia. But at the end of the day, North Korea has had this reputation as a hermit kingdom since the 1990s. And I was just thinking, as I was watching all of this pompous circumstance, all of this circus, all of this nonsense, and I saw this painting of Putin next to Kim Jong-un in front of all of this, just like all of this aesthetic that the North Koreans like put on everything. And man, this is the future. This is the future that the Russians have chosen. This is the future that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were so many thousands, tons of different possibilities that they could have gone down. They could have become like the most libtardy of libtardy countries. They could have just become like a Viktor Orban type authoritarian. It could have done a million different things. And this is the circumstance we end at. This is where we end up after all this time. It's just a cycle. Just a cycle over there. Anyway, since we don't know all of the fine details of the agreement, all we can really do is speculate. Since we know it covers trade, defense, and stuff of that manner, I can imagine that it would cover things like, oh, North Korea is at war, Russia will send them more material. Or because, hey, Russia's at war right now, so North Korea sends them more material. If North Korea is at war, then Russia will send them more material. It could mean more diplomatic backing on the international stage, as the North Koreans are trying to still, after decades and decades and decades of diplomatic isolation, try to break that international diplomatic isolation. But let's read a little bit about what could be in the deal. And then I just want to make a few comments about some things, mainly about the weapon systems and comparing it to the war in Ukraine that Vladimir Putin did to kind of justify to the public, justify to the world why he's making these deals with the North Koreans when basically no one in the world is super thrilled about this. I mean, there's probably a few countries, but if you were to go in the UN, I don't think the UN would just overwhelmingly vote to condemn North Korea, to condemn their rocket tests over Japanese territory, to condemn their their continued pursuit of nuclear proliferation. Uh, let's read a little bit about what's in the deal. Both Russian President Vladimir Putin and North Korean leader Kim-Jong say the strategic partnership they signed Wednesday is a breakthrough, but neither side has released a text of the agreement that resulted from their summit in Pyongyang, and its consequences for the near and long term are uncertain. Relations between sprawling Russia and small, isolated North Korea, both of them nuclear powers, have warmed significantly in recent years amid Russia's growing acrimony with the West over the invasion of Ukraine and suppression of all domestic opposition. The new agreement could bring them even closer, while also posing new challenges to the international community. What's in the new partnership, according to Kim and Putin? For one, what defines aggression? Putin told a briefing after the signing that the quote-unquote, the comprehensive partnership agreement provides, among other things, for the provision of mutual assistance in the event of aggression against one of the parties to this document. Again, the reason I think it's probably about war material is we have no reports of North Korean soldiers fighting in Ukraine. We have no reports of North Korean soldiers being moved to do that, anything that's leaked. What we do have reports of is North Korean shells and munitions flooding into Russia to make up for their deficits so they can continue to try to have a 5-1, a 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-1 shell advantage over the Ukrainians. If they don't have that shell advantage, there is no chance of the Russians pushing forward. At every time the Russians have pushed forward, it has been in large part because of that shell advantage. So if they cannot sustain it, they got to find shells from somewhere. That's where the North Koreans come in. Now, there could be other things that could be provided on the North Korean side and outside of just sending weapons in the event that North Korea is at war, because North Korea is probably very cognizant of the fact that, yeah, they have nuclear weapons, so does the United States. And if the United States still covers South Korea with its nuclear umbrella, then at the end of the day, they are facing the threat of nuclear annihilation for crossing that border. So they're probably, at least in the short term and to midterm, the North Koreans would want to find some other benefit they could get out of this. And I saw one thing that AP was speculating, and I think does make sense, is the North Koreans could be trying to find new ways to get hard laborers over to Russia to work there so they can bring US greenback dollars or other type of international currencies into North Korea in order for them to circumnavigate the international sanctions that have been placed upon their country. In fact, this is already a long-standing relationship between the North Koreans and the Russians, is they'll take laborers from North Korea, ship them out to Russia, they'll do hard labor, and then after that period's done, they'll be shipped back. And then the money made from that is sent to Pyongyang for whatever purposes they might have. Now, they have other ways of trying to get hard cash, a lot of illicit activities, hacking. I've heard things about drug smuggling, but it's been so long that I can't really tell you if that's the case. The way that they keep these laborers in line can be pretty brutal. If you have a laborer working in Russia, to fight help fight the Western imperialism and digging trenches or digging, ditches for whatever purpose, and you're like, man, I don't like this. This kind of sucks. What if I just leave? Which, if you just got out of North Korea, that might be something on your mind. Well, what the North Koreans will do is they'll kidnap your family and put them all in a hard labor camp. And so they'll use your family as leverage against you. Other countries have done this type of stuff too. China does this against a lot of Chinese expats or Chinese people living overseas anytime they get too critical of the government. Or they'll be using their local underground police forces. That's a totally other story, to try to harass them. But they'll also try to leverage their family. It's never usually this brutal, but that is also something you see. Anyway, what defines aggression? Putin told a briefing after the signing that the comprehensive partnership agreement provides, among other things, for the provision of mutual assistance in the event of aggression against one of the parties to this document. The sentence raises an array of questions. The first is, what might be considered aggression? Both parties historically have used the word to denounce actions that fall short from a physical attack or even a cyber attack. True. For example, the Russians invaded Ukraine in part for what they thought was aggression against them, merely by, for example, Estonia joining NATO. Now, would they have still invaded Ukraine if Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania didn't join NATO? I think that there's a lot of ideological reasons from what Putin believes that they would, but it is a justification. Continuing. Of course, it's an alternative history scenario. It's impossible for me. North Korea takes an especially broad view. Pyongyang commonly terms the combined military exercises held between the United States and South Korea as aggression, describing them as invasion rehearsals. It often conducts its own missile tests or other military displays as part of a tit-for-tat retaliation. Nor do the so-called aggressions need to be actual actions. It has denounced the United States' criticism of North Korea's human rights record as, quote, the main means of aggression, together with the military threat, that the DPRK will have to take into consideration the resolute and decisive options for defending the sovereignty and security of the state in an all-around way. So the term aggression could mean a number of things. And so what I was talking about was mostly a war scenario. And this article talks more about the other scenarios that could be used to justify the sending over of war material and to enhance North Korean capabilities. I mean, the North Koreans are well aware of the fact that if they started a war with South Korea, there's a very good chance that they could literally be wiped off the face of the earth, because any North Korean war plan would almost certainly mean immediate and fast violence. Tons of artillery is currently aimed at Seoul for the scenario where North Korea goes to war, and their plan would be to basically pepper Seoul with so much artillery that it would be uninhabitable. And a lot of war predictions predicted that this time period is going to be the vast majority of civilian casualties, with civilians in these majorly dense cities getting hit with shells, cluster bombs, and all sort of stuff that could kill them. And while that could do immense damage, if that scenario was to play out, the United States would almost certainly not be playing games. It would unleash fire and fury back upon them. And if there was the use of nuclear weapons, the United States might very well be in a position where they feel they have to use nuclear weapons to respond if they are to uphold the nuclear deterrent. And I know that kind of sounds weird, to use a nuclear weapon to uphold the nuclear deterrent, but from the mindset of U.S. Strategic planners, they look at it like, well, if North Korea uses a nuke and then we don't use a nuke in response, then North Korea just got away with using a nuke, and that breaks down nuclear nonproliferation. So at least that's the mindset U.S. war planners would be in that scenario, and the North Koreans are aware of that. So it could be that they would want to enhance their weapons capability to use weapons in the way that weapons on the international stage are usually used in. And that is not necessarily in direct military confrontation, but using the threat of direct military confrontation to get diplomatic victories. Say, maybe the North Koreans would rather, and I know that they've been talking less, they've been saying, oh, reunification is no longer the goal of the party, et cetera, but to pursue unification on their terms, or to use this leverage to try to normalize their possession of nuclear weapons and break down the nuclear nonproliferation standard that is built up in the international community over the years. Now, that doesn't mean it hasn't been violated before. The Israelis violated it. The Indians violated it. But, I mean, North Korea is certainly the country that's gotten the most diplomatic backlash because of how they use their nuclear threat and how they use their nuclear weapons and the way they've engaged in their tests. The Indians developed nuclear capabilities just barely, blew up a nuke, got a few, just to show that they could. The North Koreans regularly launch missiles over their enemies to like, I'm going to bomb, I'm going to get you, you know? A little different. What would be the response? The kind of support pledged in the agreement was not spelled out, unlike the Article 5 clause of the NATO Charter that requires member nations to take the action they deem necessary. If their explanations of the agreement, neither Putin nor Kim said whether it specified if assistance would be troops, material, or some sort of aid. So again, assistance could mean many things. For example, when we signed the Budapest Memorandum with the Russians and the Ukrainians, it stipulated that in the scenario where Ukraine's sovereignty is stomped upon, attacked, if Ukraine was attacked, the United States and Russia, technically, according to the Budapest Memorandum, would provide Ukraine with assistance. I'm still waiting for the Russians to provide Ukraine with the aid necessary to fight the Russians, but they did kind of do that at the start of the war since they abandoned so many tanks, but that's secondary. Point is, though, when we made this agreement, we purposefully left the term assistance vague because the Ukrainians wanted a strong military commitment. They wanted something that said, Ukraine attacked, American troops on the ground, gonna beat them up, or Russian troops on the ground, gonna beat them up. But we didn't want to give that commitment. We wanted them to give up their nuclear weapons for a vague commitment to assistance. And that's ultimately what we got, because we threatened to make Ukraine an international pariah if they did not give up their nuclear weapons. And the Ukrainians had other incentives to give them up as well. And this is something where I've had a back and forth with Ukrainians about this. it was extremely expensive to keep a nuclear arsenal, and it wouldn't only be expensive to upkeep the nuclear arsenal, but also to change the nuclear arsenal so that you could actually use the weapons in Ukraine, since how they were set up is they could only be used in connection with the command in Moscow. So they would have to, change it up. They would have to continue to pay to upkeep it. And this is all while Ukraine went through a record-breaking economic crisis with an inflation rate of over 10,000%, literally breaking records at the time. So if Ukraine is dealing with the problem of street kids, Ukraine's dealing with the problem of high inflation, Ukraine's dealing with the problem with a budgetary crisis, and they need aid just to help uphold their borders and crack down on massive increases in things like human trafficking, how are they going to not only upkeep their nuclear arsenal, but on top of upkeeping it, retrofit it so it can actually be used in Ukraine? All while America's main Ukraine's main aid beneficiaries or aid givers, the United States, is telling them they will make them a pariah if they do not give up their nuclear weapons. Now, maybe if Ukraine called their bluff, the situation would have changed. I mean, the idea was that if you acquired nuclear weapons after the United States, Russia, and a few other allies did, then you would get this isolation, and that didn't happen to the Indians. It didn't happen to the Israelis. But also, Ukraine in the 1990s is a very different than Israel in the 1970s, 80s, or whenever we got the confirmation that they made nuclear weapons. It's a very secretive program, so we don't really know a lot of the specifics. We only have broad strokes. Same thing for the Indians. What would be the response? The kind of support pledged in the agreement was not spelled out. What if there's no aggression? North Korea and Russia may find reason to claim any commission of aggression against them, but they say they will help each other's militaries. Putin essentially linked such military cooperation with North Korea to Western supplies of weapons to Ukraine, referring to high-precision weapon systems, warplanes, and other high-tech weapons. The Russian Federation does not exclude the development of military technical cooperation with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in accordance with the document signed today. The statement, in effect, formalizes the Western country's claim is already happening. The U.S. and other allies allege that Russia has received ballistic missiles and ammunition from North Korea. Yeah, by the way, before we gave approval for you, and this is what I wanted to talk about, and this is the thing that blew me away. Number one, Russia invaded Ukraine, okay? Ukraine firing back at them is what you should expect. This is the equivalent of you going to like a gas station, picking a fight with somebody, they punch you in the nose, and then you start sobbing like a bitch. That's the equivalent of what's happening here when the Russians whine about American weapons being used against their air bases, being used across the border. And apparently, I do want to say, it looks like that not only is American weapons approved to be used in Belgorod, it also looks like it's also being approved to be used across the border from Sumy, because of the recent Chechen recon groups that were sent over to raise the Russian flag, either for propaganda purposes or, as I suspect, diversionary purposes, as trying to pull troops away from the Donbass. And now that could result in ATACMS being fired from Sumy into Russia, hitting air bases that are being used against Ukraine. So that could have, just like the Volchansk offensive, a negative side effect that the Russians might have not suspected. But again, they picked a fight. They should expect to get punched back. But before we gave approval for these weapons to be used against Russia, North Korea had shipped long-range missiles to the Russians, and then the Russians used them against Ukraine. So what we're saying here is that North Korea has more weapons flexibility, and the Russians have more weapons flexibility for what they can use those weapons for than the United States, and us sending weapons to the country defending itself, not invading another country. So that means North Korea would be able to send missiles to Russia and then have those missiles used against Ukraine with no consequences for the North Koreans, but then the Americans can't because escalation. Did the North Koreans care about the escalation? Did the escalation end up mattering after these strikes on Belgorod? It's been 20, 30 days. What has happened? What's the big change? Is this the big change? Because there was already military cooperation deepening between the Russians and the North Koreans because they were using these weapons that they desperately needed from the North Koreans. Just the rampant hypocrisy I just have to point out, because if I don't point out, I just feel like I'm just leaving a big gaping hole in the story. What's the economic aspect of the pact? The partnership also calls for the development of economic ties, an especially important issue for North Korea as it suffers under an array of international sanctions. North Korea needs goods and materials, and in turn can supply Russia with war-depleted workforces with labor. See, these are the hard laborers I was talking about earlier. Those workers in turn could convert wages and rubles to dollars or euros and send hard currency back home. Putin said the Russian-North Korean trade turnover has risen ninefold over the past year, but admitted that the amount itself remains quote-unquote modest. Okay, so we still don't know exactly what assistance means. It could be vague because some of this could be diplomatic posturing that the North Koreans hope expands. But I would not bet on it being diplomatic posturing because we already have North Korean cruise missiles. We already have North Korean shells being sent to Russia to be used against Ukraine. That has to come with some reciprocation. Russia is in a position of reduced leverage due to the pressure placed upon them by the war. And it's not only the North Koreans that realize this, but the Chinese that realize this too. The Chinese and the Russians have not been able to come to an agreement about the construction of an oil pipeline between Russia and China because the Chinese want the Russians to pay for it all and basically accept like half of what they would get before the war for these crude products. Now, imagining the Russians here, this is humiliating. This is disgusting. You're known for these natural resources. This is what people think of what Russia provides to the world. At the top of the list, it's these resources. I'm not saying that they've never provided anything else to the war. Obviously, Ukraine's seen other things that Russia has provided for the world. But that's the thing. And now China is taking advantage of the fact that Europe doesn't want to buy their product anymore, unless it's through Turkey and an intermediary that can make them feel better. But Europe doesn't want to buy their product. The Americans aren't buying their product. And they don't have the oil infrastructure in place to just ship it anywhere else. So they have to build it. So they have to come to an agreement to build it. And that agreement hasn't been made yet, holding up the whole process because the Chinese want to use the leverage to get as much out of it as possible. They want to juice the Russians. And so when people talk about like the BRICS alliance and how strong it is, a lot of these countries are seeking their own self-interest, and their self-interest is interested in creating a multipolar world order. It is interested in breaking up American hegemony. It's interested in breaking up the international rules-based order. It's interested in eliminating the taboos upon certain types of aggression. So they have those alignments, but that doesn't mean they're 100% aligned. Russia and China has many differences. And if the Chinese can, screw the Russians while getting more out of it, why wouldn't they? And I'm going to say the same thing about the North Koreans. And so my question to you would be, since Russia is in a position of reduced leverage and North Korea came in clutch and got them all these artillery shells and missiles, what did Putin offer in return? Certainly some military technological development, but how far that development is, how tied it is to the nuclear weapons program, not only threatens Asia proper, but also the United States as well. We have no clue. We can only speculate. But certainly we can see that North Korea and Russia are getting closer, and the North Koreans are certainly going to take advantage of the leverage that they know they have. Stay safe, Dylan. Yeah, I'll do my best.